organic material, paper, soil, cardboard, pizza boxes. Most of the compost facilities in Vermont are not doing that. We take biodegradable bags or liners, and we're all out diversion. So we are not certified organic compost. You can't be certified in Vermont if you take any biodegradable. Based on GMO. Which doesn't make any technical sense, but that's what it is. So you can see there's a lot of cardboard and paper. I really like that because that's carbon, and we don't have enough leaves from our curbside program in Brattleboro to. I have to go get wood chips, so I'm getting paid for the carbon that comes in the paper and cardboard. It literally cuts in half the amount of leaves or wood chips I use. There's a lot of paper carbon. We get just 1 week, 2 weeks of leaves in the spring and 2 weeks of leaves in the fall. So it's not much. We have some industrial sources of food scraps. This is a company called Vermont Red Company, who went out of business last April. We were getting about 700 tons a year from beautiful source of dough and bread. I have another bakery, it's a gluten-free called Against the Grain. So we get a lot of food scraps and eggshells from that. The eggshells are actually slow release fertilizer. And if you look at our compost closely, you see little white flakes, this eggshells. So I can identify my compost slow release. Those eggs, they're sucked, the yolks are sucked out by a machine. Millions of eggs. And they use that in their bacon. Then we get the eggs in the bags. That's my loader. 3 years ago. 5 cubic yard bucket. It's all technology. So this is about the regulatory aspects. In Vermont, you could get a permit by simply registering your facility. You don't have to go through solid waste facility permitting. And it limits you to 2,000 cubic yards per year of food waste. And another 3,000 yards. We also have a permit to take soil, paper, cardboard. We basically turn the piles out every 2 weeks. Regulations, and all my operators, including me, are certified through Vermont's compost operator certification program. This shows you how facilities been increasing. We had a little bit of a dip in 2020 due to COVID. You know, restaurants and schools were closed. But as of this April, we were on track to probably hit 600 tons from just the curbside collection in Brattleboro. In addition to the Brattleboro, we have haulers picking up from commercial establishments. So we have about half of our food waste comes from commercial collection programs. So we altogether were over 1,000 tons. We had to, the state said, you guys are exceeding your permit, you've got to cut back, which was kind of disappointing. They mandate food scrap collection. We very successfully implement it, and then they tell us, oh no, you gotta turn away customers unless you get another permit. And that's what I'm talking about. We had Keene State College coming in, fantastic program. 5 years I worked with Keene State to set it up with their dining hall. It's a model program if anyone wants to see how a university does it. UVM has a great program too.
UMass Amherst too, there. That's how we met.
So Brattleboro curbside, 2,000 plus residents. They serve up to apartments with up to 4 units. After that is considered a commercial source. And those, all residents in Vermont now are supposed to divert food scraps. There's no real enforcement, but that's the way the law reads. So we have supermarkets, colleges, all the transfer stations in our district also have food scrap collection. It's mandatory. If you have a transfer station, you have to provide food scrap collection. So we have 7 transfer stations. So we do everything by a scale and weigh tons, but the state regulations are written in cubic yards. So we had to do a lot of work figuring out what a truckload from a commercial route with restaurants was in terms of food scraps versus paper versus yard waste. And so we have a lot of spreadsheets that load is about 30% food scraps. So we extrapolated cubic yards. I voluntarily reported to DEC that we were exceeding a permit and said, what are we going to do? Can we get a variance? Nope, no variance. So what they require to go to the next level, which would double our capacity to 5,000 cubic yards of food and 10,000 cubic yards total, is collect and treat leaching or prevent its occurrence by covering the facility. Engineering studies I had them done by our consultants were easily looking at $500,000 either solution. The leachate collection could be very costly to pump out and treat at a wastewater treatment plant. I can't use that leachate in my process. My piles are usually too wet, so it's not like I can just spray the piles. So we're looking at now well, this is the regulations to go to a medium facility. Anyway, we've decided we want to do an enclosed facility. There's what our engineering estimates. It could cost $65,000 a year to pump out leachate and take it to a wastewater plant. So we're looking at a fabric building on about 8,000 square foot pad to have active composting covered for 2 weeks. That gets you into the legal compliance with the active composting phase for 15 days. And we're going to look at an aerated static pile. So technically you can make compost that meets the pathogen reduction requirements in as little as 3 or 4 days with aerated systems. But we're planning on 2-week retention time. Or actually 3 weeks. There we go. We're getting into Mike's presentation. So what I wanted to also point out is the compost we're making is very. All right. Anyway, the compost we're making, we sell out. I sold about 4,000 cubic yards last year at 5 distributors, garden centers, and we sell it to them for $25 a cubic yard, and then they mark it up to 45 or 50 dollars a cubic yard. We sold $80,000 worth of compost last year. And this compost facility is tracked as a cost center. It had a profit of $100,000. So it's been a really positive new facility. The district, when I started there 10 years ago, was operating a dual stream MRF. And in 2017, our 19 towns voted to close it because of single stream was just taking over. We didn't have enough tonnage to justify keeping it running. But the composting has been our new focus. So we have 4 commercial haulers that bring food scraps to us. They built up really substantial businesses around organics collection. The thing about taking paper and cardboard is they use their regular dumpsters, 2-yard, 4 cubic yard dumpsters. So there's not totes, they're not hauling food scraps in toters. They may at a few locations haul, so they didn't have to invest in new equipment. And the dumpsters, they just come in a packer truck, with 9 to 12 tons per load. Just dump it. So the other part of this is our odor control. Because we have a lot of paper and cardboard, we really have very little odor associated. It absorbs the liquids in the loads. It really very little odor associated with the material when it comes in and while it's being composted. We've had no odor complaints. That's important, as you all know. A lot of facilities have been closed due to odor. So overall, we're very happy with the project. So now I'm looking for funding to make a $500,000 investment. I applied for federal earmark money. They now call it congressionally directed spending through Senator Sanders' office. We've been approved for $175,000. It still has to get through the U.S. Congress appropriations. Then we're looking at, and you'll be hearing John Hughes talk later today, USDA, Community Facilities Grant Money. We've been preliminarily approved for $50,000. And then we're hoping that the Vermont DEC has another round of infrastructure grant money. The loader we bought was at 40% grant, so that could give us up to 100,000. Then the district itself is prepared by board to contribute over $150,000. So I think we're up there. We won't know on the federal money until fall. That's where we're at, and I would encourage anyone who wants to stop by Brattleboro, see our operation. You're welcome to visit. Just some big piles in the field. But we have a screener, and that makes, we use a 1/2-inch screen to make our farm. So yes, I'll open up for questions, right?
Yeah, I think if anyone has clarifying questions now, definitely ask them now. What we'd ask is that if you're going to have discussion-related questions, they're going to take a little longer to wait before speakers have spoken.
I just had a quick question.
Sure.
Does they mandate you to test your compost
Testing it?
for having that for metals?
Yes, it's Vermont DEC regulations require 1 test per year. And it's what's federal EPA 503 heavy metals, and then pathogens, fecal, and salmonella. I also sent samples to the University of Maine, get like an agronomic analysis on various micronutrients, and it's a very high quality compost. The nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are about like a manure, 1-1-1, so it's not high strength NPK, but with the paper and cardboard, it has very significant moisture holding properties. It absorbs moisture, the compost does. And that's the fiber, the lignins, and the compost. So that's one of the main benefits of using compost is moisture retention. Yes.
One thing that people bring up in addition to odor, it sounds like that's not a problem.
Rodents?
Do you have a rodent problem?
No, not at all. Like anything, it's all about management. Our loads that come in every day, within a couple hours, the load is covered
and mixed into the pile. The temperatures rapidly increased to 140, 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And so there's really no attractive component. There are things that roll off the pile, but we will pick those up at no rodents. We do have a fair number of birds and hawks that hang around the area, so that helps. Actually, bald eagles too. Overall, it's been a good project for the town of Brattleboro. They have over 65% recycling rate because of the organics diversion programs, curbside recycling and curbside food scrap collection. And the town saves about $40,000 a year, paying us $52 a ton for their food scraps versus $115 a ton for trash. So the delta on that, 600 tons with a $40 a ton, it's cost savings. So I say they're about being green. It's money. Michael.
Feedback and get information on what in our rules could be changed or improved. And then didn't really do much after that. Unfortunately, again, we've been struggling with lack of resources. So it's been one of those things we've been working on fits and starts. But in 2021, the legislature weighed in again, saying, DES, you gotta finish this rulemaking. So they set a deadline at the end of 2021 for us to actually start the rulemaking process. So that's where we are today. By March of this year, we actually got those rules finally adopted. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit today is what those rules are, just a highlight of some of the major changes that we made. But first, just to give you an overview, some of you may be familiar, but for those that aren't, the old rules had a number of things that folks really didn't, there's a lot of stakeholder feedback that they didn't like. First of all, the old composting rules did not allow meat and dairy composting under a permit by notification. We basically, in New Hampshire, we have two permit types. Permit by notification, which is kind of similar to what Bob talked about in Vermont, where you can just register to obtain a permit. And then we have a standard permit, which is a more complicated, more intensive process where you have to go through a permitting review. And so under the old rules, the only permit type that allowed for food scraps composting with meat and dairy was the standard permit. So folks saw that as kind of an impediment to developing more infrastructure in the state that would address food scraps diversion. The old rules also had some pretty severe siting criteria requiring any composting facility to meet the same siting criteria as for a landfill. And we recognize that a landfill and a composting facility are not necessarily the same type of facility, they shouldn't be equated. The old rules also had an outdated classification system for finished compost. There are basically 2 tiers of compost, which was modeled more or less after the federal 503 regulations for biosolids. And there was a pretty complex and complicated system for sampling and testing of that compost. And finally, there was also some provisions in our rules that basically didn't allow for small scale composting. Basically, any kind of composting required a permit, whether, well, let me back up. If you composted in your backyard or on site, you didn't need a permit. But any other type of composting basically needed a permit. So there wasn't any provision for like community composting or something happening at a very small scale. Those are some of the things that we got feedback on over the years about the old rules. So we tried to address that with the new rules. So with the new rules, we revised the requirements for a permit by notification facility to definitely allow meat dairy composting, with an emphasis on EMPs or management of the process. Bob mentioned it's all about management, right? So if you're going to be composting things that have potential for odors or pathogens, really it comes down to managing the process and making sure that you're following the NHDES. We scrapped the connection to the landfill siting criteria, and we set new siting criteria for new composting facilities. Any existing composting facilities in New Hampshire are grandfathered, because we don't expect them to have to, if they've already obtained a permit and they're already sited, it doesn't make any sense to have them move if they're not in compliance. We also got rid of the compost classification system, and we replaced it with new minimum quality requirements that apply universally to all compost. So as long as the compost is produced in a manner that meets those minimum quality requirements, it's safe for distribution and use. And in terms of small scale operations, we also updated the rules to add new permit exemptions for small scale operations, like food scrap collection sites, like drop-off sites that can, kind of act as small scale transfer stations for food waste, and also a permit exemption for community composting. So a site that does actually processing of the food waste and making compost. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into each of those elements that I just talked about in the new rules. So with the new permit by notification requirements, like I said, a permit by notification facility is now eligible to compost food waste, including meat and dairy. I want to make that very clear because that's been the main sticking point for a lot of stakeholders over the years. Now you can do that under permit by notification, and this applies to existing permit by notification facilities in the state. So any facilities that years ago obtained a permit and were only able to compost food scraps like vegetative or bakery waste or things like that, now they have the option of including meat and dairy into that mix as well. In addition, they can also compost compostable packaging and paper, like Bob was talking about in Brattleboro, where they take in cardboard, they take in food soil paper, they take in like biodegradable polymers. So that is now something that is an option as well. Some facilities may choose not to for operational reasons, but at least it is authorized under the rules. So there's a number of things that they can compost in addition to the food waste. And like I mentioned, the idea is to really, the rules have been developed to emphasize BMPs to ensure efficient aerobic composting. As most of us know, I hope maybe some of us don't, but composting is a biological process. It's mainly driven by microbes. So in order to make those microbes happy, you got to give them enough food, you got to give them enough water, and you got to give them enough air, right? So that's some of the BMPs are focused on making sure that they have food, which is the carbon and nitrogen ratio, moisture within a certain level so that it's not too dry and it's not too wet, because if it's too wet, it's going to go anaerobic and you're not going to have efficient composting. If it's too dry, there's not enough moisture for the microbes to actually do their work, right? And then bulk density is really, that's where you're trying to ensure that the material is not so dense that it doesn't allow enough air porosity for the airflow through the material. And then we also incorporate some common sense provisions for managing odors, such as making sure that waste is incorporated into the active process within a couple of hours of receipt, or otherwise stored, to prevent odors and leachate from being released. And also, other things like managing the process, on an ongoing basis to make sure that you're up to, changing your recipe as needed, or adjusting your turning procedures to limit release of odors. I also forgot to mention covering the pile with a biofilter as necessary, so you can use like a layer of finished compost or something like that to help filter out odors that might be emanating. Just some more details on the new siting requirements. So the new siting requirements are fairly simple. They're really targeted at protecting water sources. So composting facility for us, when we're talking about regulating the facility, because the composting facility is not necessarily just a building, right? It can take a number of different forms, but for us, what we're talking about is the food or the solid waste receipt management storage areas, and also the active composting area. So it could be areas where you initially receive the food waste or the compostable feedstocks, where you mix them together, like mixing areas at the site, and then also the active composting. So that would be the windrows or the static piles or whatever method you're using. So the site requirements apply to those portions of the facility. They wouldn't necessarily apply to like storage of cured compost or storage of finished compost. It's really the active management areas. And those areas need to be 75 feet away from any private drinking water well, and not within the protected radius of a public drinking water well. Most public water supply wells in New Hampshire have a certain radius depending on their production volume, where activities are restricted within that radius. These facilities also would need to be 75 feet from any surface waters or wetlands, and also not within the protected shoreline of the public water, which in New Hampshire would mean not within 250 feet of most rivers and lakes. And then we also have some requirements in terms of like separation, ground water separation. There's a 2-foot minimum separation to areas with seasonal high water table, and also they need to be in an edge like at least 2 feet above standing gravel deposits or bedrock. But the standing gravel deposit and separation to bedrock only applies if the facility is using in situ soils for its working surface. If they use an impermeable pad, it doesn't apply. Here we have a picture of Bob's loader. So just want to talk a little bit about the new quality requirements. As I mentioned, we scrapped the compost classification system. It's kind of outdated. It wasn't really in keeping with what other states were doing. So what we've done is we've established minimum requirements that apply universally to all compost. And the quality restrictions apply to heavy metals, certain pathogens and bacteria such as salmonella and fecal coliform, and also man-made inert matter. So we have a standard for things that aren't going to break down. When I say inert matter, I'm talking about like plastic, metal, glass, things that just aren't going to break down in the compost system. So there's a standard for the finished compost to have a certain threshold of that material. And, the idea is to limit potential for distribution of compost that might not be suitable for certain applications. We also incorporated maturity requirements. Basically, maturity is a measure of how finished the compost is. It's kind of I like to call it the finish line when you're composting. Like once you've reached the finish line, the compost is mature. So we have measures for maturity using 2 parameters. One is the aerobic or microbial respiration and then also ammonium, the presence of ammonium in the mix. And then, as in Vermont, we require testing once annually to make sure that folks are complying with these quality requirements. So I just want to talk a little bit more about those permit exemptions. There's two. The first one I'll talk about is the food waste drop-off and collection sites. This is intended to provide a little bit more flexibility for community centers that wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't think of them as typical like solid waste facilities. So like food co-ops, for example, have been a common place for folks to drop off food scraps that are then collected by a hauler or a, some sort of composting company that takes it away and processes it at their composting site. So this is an activity that was already happening in New Hampshire, so we wanted to, we want to basically put it in our rules so that it would contemplate that kind of activity and make sure that that wasn't, something that would require a permit. So these facilities are able to store up to 1 cubic yard at any one time. The food scraps would need to be stored no longer than 1 week before being transferred off-site. And just to back up, when I say 1 cubic yard, to put that in perspective, that's essentially 40 5-gallon buckets or 3 64-gallon toters, which is kind of in line with what a lot of these food co-ops are doing. And it doesn't need to be just food co-ops; it could be other community centers or other locations within a municipality that serves as a convenient drop-off location. The other thing this could enable is, especially in rural areas, where a composting company may want to start up a hauling route, it would allow them to have kind of satellite collection points in rural neighborhoods where that way they don't have to go to every single neighborhood or house. Folks could use those drop-off centers as consolidation points for food scraps, and then the hauler could go around and pick up to those locations and bring it to the composting facility. And then lastly, and I think I'm probably going to make some nice speed record here. I think this is kind of my presentation. The last permit exemption is for community composting facilities. And so this one's envisioned to allow small-scale composting operations. For example, if somebody wants to start a composting business in New Hampshire, but they really just want to almost kind of start at a pilot scale to test the waters, this kind of permit exemption would allow them to do that without needing to seek a solid waste permit first. And as their operations grow, they could definitely, they could then seek permit. They could go to the permit by notification very easily. And it could also allow, community gardens or other places to kind of serve as a location where the community could bring their food scraps to be processed and thereby kind of increase diversion, increase access for communities to food scraps diversion. So with this community composting permit exemption, it allows the facility to receive up to 5 cubic yards of food scraps per month. The footprint of the composting area, the waste receipt, storage, and processing areas, that needs to fit within a 600 square foot area. So these aren't really intended to be large facilities. And the composting process would need to conform with just generally accepted DMPs. And so we're hopeful that that'll allow folks a little bit more flexibility to start their own composting operations. And in general, we're hopeful that these rules will, lay the groundwork again just to create a little bit better atmosphere for composting in New Hampshire, and hopefully, get more infrastructure developed in New Hampshire. We don't have Act 148 in New Hampshire. We don't have a mandate for diversion of food waste. But we do hope that the new rules will allow those that are interested in composting to have more access to that. So there's my contact information. If you guys want to reach out to me at any point, you're more than welcome to. And I think we're probably going to do question and answer as well. So I'm hopeful that we have some good questions.
Yeah, if people have questions, I will come around with the mic, since we are streaming this. Talk into the mic and say your question.
Hi, I know that there's a bit of a science to composting. You have to do it right to be successful. And I guess Maine has a composting school. Does New Hampshire, like, how would transfer stations or other groups that are looking to start up and have no experience get the great training made successful?
That's a great question. I think education is one of the, especially in New Hampshire, there's been a lack of education around how to actually operate a composting facility. The Maine Compost School is by far and away one of the best schools. I've actually attended the Maine Compost School, and it is one of the best resources in the Northeast for learning about composting. New Hampshire DES doesn't have a training program specifically for composting yet. We may in the future. So that's something that we'll probably be looking into. I know that there's also other trainings available through organizations like SWANA, the U.S. Composting Council. There's an online training right now that was just started by a gentleman named James McSweeney. I think he calls it the 131-degree School of Composting. And that's an online training that folks can participate in. So there are more options available, and I hope that in New Hampshire that we can also develop some more
Time I'm just running in front. Wondering if you guys are monitoring for PFAs or microplastics. That's something one's radar screen.
That's a great question. So with PFAS, it is on our radar, but it isn't something that when we were developing the rules, we weren't ready to be able to make any standards for PFAS content. It's definitely a concern. I know the industry commonly says, you know, we're end of pipe. This is not, we're not the ones creating the PFAS issue. It's actually all the products and all the packaging that is upstream that kind of influences what ends up in the compost. But the fact of the matter is there's definitely PFAS in a lot of the places we look for it, right? So at some point we probably will need to address PFAS. I think New Hampshire is continuing to investigate that, and the EPA is also investigating it. It's very likely that New Hampshire will be looking at adopting soil remediation standards for PFAS. And when that day comes, we'll probably be looking at how we need to adjust the composting rules to meet those new standards. And with microplastics, that's also another area of kind of emerging study. We are not, it's not contemplated in the current rules.
This is Bobby again. Vermont does have a program with the University of Vermont looking at microplastics. Casella Waste Services funded it, and it's more around the repackaging technologies. Plastic getting into the soil. So it's being evaluated as far as PFAS and the various compounds associated with that. There is no soil standard for Vermont yet, and I was asked by one of our DEC regulators if I would test our compost for us. I will standard, but you know what's the point? I am concerned about it. It's a sleeping issue because we take a lot of paper and cardboard, and it's definitely in that. So it actually could be something that does major damage to the composting industry. It's very restrictive regulations. As far as the plastics, we have more pieces of plastic in our compost, but we don't grind or shred our input materials. So most of the plastic that comes in is screened out by a half-inch screen. Some composting facilities have mixers, grinders, and that particleizes plastic. So there is an issue with plastic for sure. But I basically say let the marketplace decide if it's acceptable with a few flakes of plastic. But so does yard waste. So it's an issue. It's coming.
Yeah, John Walter, questions about how you're able to prevent contamination from getting into your dumpsters that are being used by some of your haulers. So that becoming a potential landfill composting facility.
Well, I was very skeptical when Brattleboro said they wanted to have residential collection of food scraps, that we would have a high quality. But it's been absolutely amazing. People are really conscientious. I think, but there is always contamination. But as I was saying, our half-inch trommel screen pulls most of it out. It's practically all of it's removed. So we do have some commercial dumpsters that obviously get contamination or illegal use. So there are locked, some of them are locked, have keys only for the owner, but most of them are not. They're just out in a parking lot, downtown Brattleboro, and 5 restaurants use it. And so, but not grinding and shredding. But Chittenden always has a very aggressive turning machine, and it's mixing, but it also breaks up plastic, so they have more issues. In fact, they decided not to take biodegradable plastics or cutlery anymore. Depends on your technology.
I'm sorry I came in late, you may have already covered this. We're a very small town, southwestern New Hampshire, Harrisville. We have, at home, in my home, I have gone through 2 great home composting bins over the years. And I can get compost out of it for a garden spread of about 2 feet by 8 feet every year. So my flower gardens, vegetable gardens are all full of this compost collected. But because we're such a small town, trying to do this kind of composting effort just seems like it might be a struggle. But do any of the towns sell composting bins at their transfer recycling station? So that, because that's where ours have always come from, is that we purchase them through a depot recycling station. You know, if anybody had any experience with that, I thought that might be an easy way to start doing this, to sell these bins.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's not something that I am directly aware of. I know that the NRA does annually do a compost bin sale, where they kind of, I think you have to buy in bulk and then you distribute to, like NRA distributes to the member communities, and then those communities can sell them to residents. I don't know if there's anybody here that can speak more
Hampstead does.
through the NRA.
Yep, we get their annual bulk and then we sell it for a small fee.
So there are opportunities with NRA that might be other organizations that do that as well.
If you call the office at the NRA, we do sell composting items individually.
It's been a fairly common practice over the years through NRA and through other states where they will do a bulk compost bin sale, and then the towns will subsidize that and sell it to residents at discounted price.
On a second note, I just want to let everybody know, we started my name is Chad Clayton from Dennistown, Massachusetts, and our transfer station started a drop-off composting, food waste composting program, and we actually got money from a grant through the state, and we actually bought kitchen toters, and we bought 65-gallon toters for the facility for drop-off. And we noticed that we had a lot of people that wanted to get involved in it. They got involved, and then a lot of people stopped for a while, they were kind of turning in their bins and leaving their bins next to the 65-gallon toter. So I actually was standing there and somebody was like, oh, we dropped this toter off, this isn't for me. I said, well, why isn't it for you? What's not working about it? I said, well, now I have to take this container back, put it in my car, it's all wet, it's sloppy. And I suggested to them to use the biodegradable bags because those are welcomed in our program. Come to find out, we've now almost doubled our food waste intake by offering bio bags. It's easy. People take them, they tie them up, they bring them in and leave their containers at home. They don't have to rinse their containers out. So it really pushed, more food waste coming in because it's a little bit cleaner. So just a point for any upcoming towns that are going to try to implement the program.
Hi, Mike. Could you speak a little bit about the interrelationship of these regs as they relate to the permits, the solid waste permits that towns have? Because as you know, there's been some confusion about whether transfer stations can accept food scraps for composting just through their standard permit. Just to clarify that there's not as huge a hurdle for a municipality to get into it as some might think.
And thanks for the question. So there's a couple different ways to look at that. I guess you could say if you have a municipal facility transfer station that wants to collect food scraps and then transfer them to another facility for further processing, that usually doesn't require much in terms of paperwork from the department. Because it's already, that's part of the facility's function is as a transfer station, right? So it's probably already taking the food waste in part of the MSW stream. So if all they want to do is separate it out and send it to a vendor who's going to compost it, that's not really a big deal. They may need to update their operating plan, but that would probably be the extent of it. In terms of a facility, like if a municipal transfer station wanted to actually compost on site, so if they wanted to collect food scraps in the community and compost at their facility, there's a little bit of, there's a couple of ways of going about that. They could apply for a permit by notification composting facility and just have that site kind of co-located with their transfer station. So they'd have two permits for one location. One for the transfer station, one for the composting operation. There's also a provision in our rules that allows an existing permit by notification transfer station to basically just notify the department that they're going to start composting. So they would basically compost under their existing transfer station permit. But that only applies if the facility has an existing permit by notification. If the facility has a standard permit, that's where the other option would probably be best, where they just basically they don't change their standard permit for the transfer station, they just get another permit for the composting operation. And that in some ways actually is preferable because it creates a little bit of a delineation where you basically have two separate facilities on site. So it just creates a little bit of a boundary between those two activities because they're functionally distinct facilities. I don't know if that answered your question or if that made it muddier. Okay.
My name is Audrey Bethel, and I'm on the Solid Waste Advisory Board in Hillsborough. I was just going to say about the selling compost bins at reduced cost to residents for the backyard composting option with the NRRA's annual sale. It's really great if a town's member can collaborate and coordinate with volunteers so that the folks running the transfer station don't have to do the compost bin thing. So that's kind of like a volunteer-led effort, and then the pallet of compost bins can get delivered to the transfer station if it's all coordinated with the folks who work at the transfer station, but just because it's like, a busy site as it is, it's nice to have people who are volunteering, kind of, coordinate those efforts. It's worked out really well in our town in the past few years.
And there's a lot of people who have questions about compost, and so volunteers can be ready and available to talk a lot about compost, not have to worry about the transfer station operating.
Ryan Cullen, Simplicity Equipment. There have been a question as far as training on board or somewhere as far as we deal with processing of composting equipment. That's what we specialize in. But the USCC of New Jersey is putting on a compost operations training next month for about 5 days down in this town, New Jersey. But overall, it would be worthwhile if anybody does want any info. Jersey has put sort of a big focus on it. Pay attention to their stuff, as well as USCC, US Compost Council, does end up doing 3 shows a year.
So I don't want to add a glitch in here, but to jump off of Karen's question, Mike, can you explain if, say, a town wants to take in food waste scraps for composting, and their service area is just their town, but you've got residents in a neighboring town who also want to do that, but their town and their facility refuses to do it. Can they bring their food scraps to the other town's permanent facility? It's that service area question that's gonna get.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how they develop the permit initially. When they apply for the permit, what service area are they envisioning? I think I want to say most of the permit by notification composting facilities that we have issued to date have an unlimited service area to envision exactly what you're talking about, so that it doesn't restrict the town if they wish to collaborate with other towns. It would allow them to do that, so that they can, cast a wider net, so to speak, in terms of allowing for access to food waste diversion.
Hey, Joe, 2 questions. First, what kind of substance have to be in the compost to produce the ammonia? Are there things that we should avoid? We can keep those levels down. And the second question is to you, Mike. Does the state offer any kind of an educational outreach program for towns if they want to educate their residents a little bit more about composting, backyard type composting?
Right, that kind of gets, I'll answer that question first. I kind of get back to the initial question about training, and there is a lack of training in New Hampshire right now. There are trainings available, most of them are at a cost. Or you need to travel long distances like down to New Jersey, which, they're great trainings, but it's not feasible for everyone. So that is something that I hope that the department might be able to either provide or partner with other organizations in the future to provide those training opportunities, more education and outreach around that. And Tara's like wiggling her fingers back there, she wants to say something.
So, Sarah Albert, I run the solid waste operator training program for New Hampshire, so I train operators. Composting is something we're not focused on. We do have some education outreach material.
The Lakes Regional Planning Commission did a push a few years ago to educate their residents. We still have a lot of that information for the presentations are not videos, but we have a lot of paperwork. So if anyone wants to contact me, I can get that to you so you can have it and at least get started. And it's pretty low level education on backyard composting and at municipal towns.
And to answer your first question, ammonia, ammonium, there's different forms of nitrogen that are just present in the material, in the compostable organic materials. And the idea is that through the process, you're transforming mineral nitrogen to an organic form. So ammonia is really what happens when ammonium is no longer in the, I'm not an expert on the nitrogen cycle, but think back to my high school chemistry class. Ammonium happens when there's presence of water, so it's in solution generally, and ammonia happens when that ammonia converts to ammonia gas. It basically gets released as gas because it dries out or because the pH goes too high or something like that. So when you're testing for mature compost, the levels of ammonium should be pretty low because that nitrogen should have been converted over to nitrates rather than, you know, mineral forms. I don't know, Bob, if you want to.
That's good.
Okay.
Okay, so we're about out of time for the session itself, but the beautiful thing about being live again is it just come over out into the hallway, out into the exhibit hall, and I would encourage all of you to continue talking about this stuff, asking questions of all of us. Again, it's fantastic to be back live.
That laundry can.
Good morning, everybody. I am the moderator, Brian Patnell. I am from Lancaster, New Hampshire. And welcome to this workshop. Last morning, one before lunch. This should be an interesting one. I'm very interested in it myself. So it's free money. Everybody likes free money. We have quite a few speakers today. So we'll get going and should be interesting. The first person is Christine Beeling.
Hi, so I'm Chris Keeling. I work for the Environmental Protection Agency in the Boston office, EPA New England, and many familiar faces here. And can I just say, it's so nice to see faces, like in-person faces. This is I don't know, it's one of my first times back out in the world. So thank you, NRA, and thank you for being here. So we're going to talk today about EPA and some grant funding we have that's out there. So for those of you who have worked in the Sustainable Materials Management Program for years, grant funding was piddly, right? Like bits of funding. And because of kind of the harmonic convergence of many things, we now have funding, which we'll talk about. So in FY20, I'm just putting this stuff up so you can look at it if you're wonky and you care where it all kind of plays out. But the bottom line is there's 17 pieces of recycling legislation in Congress. We've got attention. We have people understanding the connections to climate change, and we have appropriations, which is the key to funding. So that is great. And again, in my career, kind of new. So this is not news to anybody here. Why do we have this funding? Well, there's challenges, right? There's challenges with the recycling system. There's challenges with markets. There's confusion over what's recycling. There's confusion into contamination. And there's environmental justice concerns where some of our facilities are sited. So we have developed a recycling strategy. Many of you might have commented on this. It talks about, I'm doing two computers, sorry. Let's make sure I get my notes here. It talks about exactly why this is an issue and why we should care about it. And it talks about stakeholders, which is everybody in this room, and what we can do about it. And the key to the strategy and why I bring it up is it talks about improving markets. It talks about increasing collection and infrastructure, reducing contamination and in the recycling stream, talking about the circular economy and how to enhance programs, EPR, take back, that type of thing. And then the other one, it talks about measuring, right? For those of you in the recycling world, everybody measures a little bit differently. Every state measures a little bit differently. So we're trying to make that a little bit more harmonic. So those are key things to think about, because when we talk about grants that are available, those are the problems that we're trying to So we have a recycling strategy, and now we have the solid waste infrastructure for recycling grant program. So that is a program that's being developed right now, brand new. And I will be honest, it's a little bit like sausage making, right? We have the money and we have to get it out the door, and I'll face it, anyone here apply for a federal grant? It's really easy, right? So, you know, we have to get all our ducks in a row to get that. I apologize. I apologize for the bureaucracy and appreciate anybody who does jump through the hoops to get us there, including my two colleagues on the dais who are successful grant recipients. So we have a total of $275 million of funding, $55 million per year for 5 years. That is in the books, that is in the bank, and that is exciting. What happens to that? Well, we're going to have this recycling infrastructure grant program to talk about our Save Our Seas Act, which is the act that appropriates the money. It's going to support improvements to post-consumer materials management, including municipal recycling programs, and assist locals, that's people like you in the room. Who's eligible? United States and political subdivisions of states, so any municipality, any kind of state government would be eligible for what we're calling SWIPR grants. And again, sausage making, so it's still in the process, but that's who's eligible by law. We have a second grant program that's coming out, Education and Outreach. This again is for folks like you in the room and for not-for-profits like NRRA. This will also be a competitive grant program, getting at those issues, contamination, all the issues that we know that are out there. The Education and Outreach Program has $75 million in funding, and 20% will be set aside for rural communities, low-income communities, and Native American communities. This administration is really very aware about the environmental justice issues, environmental protection, environmental pollution, or pollution. So very specific set-asides for communities, and again, in New Hampshire, it would be rural communities. Okay, here we go. The second grant program is a little bit broader. Like I said, units of local governments, nonprofit organizations, and the like, private-public partnerships are eligible. And what's available? All kinds of things for education and outreach, stuff that you in the room are very, very familiar with. Labeling signs, public service announcements, advertising. Again, to get the message out about recycling is important. The key is here, this is sausage making. So there will be 2 RFAs out on the street. I would expect them out in September. My very last slide has a note how to keep connected if you want to follow that. If you're interested in applying, so when we get to the very last slide, you'll see keep informed note to sign up. But I don't have a lot to say except good news. There's money. Good news, there'll be an RFA out in the street, most likely in September, and keep abreast of the situation. I want to end with something a little bit more tangible. We just closed our Healthy Communities Grant Program, a grant program we had for the past 20 years. And it did close this week or last week, so sorry if you didn't apply, but NRA did apply. So we wish them success. Not allowed to say that, I'm not biased or anything, but you know, but we do wish them success in their proposal. And I wanted to say we have this Healthy Communities Grant Program. This is one of my favorite things to administer. And I have 2 colleagues here who have grants in that program and are going to tell you about the successes that they've had. So without further ado, Chris, right. And so again, last slide. This is keep informed and sign up. We'll see what happens.
This reminds me of being back in the classroom. So thank you for listening. I brought my timer with me because Chris said if I go over 10 minutes, he said no more grants for you. So we don't want that to happen. So I'm the co-director of the Rhode Island Schools Recycling Club. And so I'm just going to tell you a little story about how we started. So I came from a very different background. My background's in broadcasting. I worked for a group of radio stations, and we would be mandated by the FCC to help nonprofit organizations with airtime. And we started running ads for different environmental organizations back in the 1990s. And every year we would produce a big birthday festival. And it was really, the sponsor was the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And in 1998, I left the radio business, but I continued to run the birthday festival. And in 2000, we had this big festival and spent a lot of money on it. We brought in a band, it was the Outlaws. And we had 10,000 people show up for this beautiful birthday festival. What do you think happened when everybody left? There was trash all over the place. So we were having a meeting and saying, is spending $100,000 on a one-day event the best way to really affect change in the environment? And somebody brought this article, which was on the front page of the Providence Journal. It was titled "Recycling's Hard Lesson." And it was about this reporter that went to this school, where the school had been recognized for their outstanding, their amazing, their wonderful recycling program. And he said to the teacher, well, what happens to the recyclables when they leave the classroom? The teacher, I don't know. Go talk to the custodian. So he went and talked to the custodian. The custodian said, we don't have a recycling program. Everything gets thrown into the trash. And so the Rhode Island Schools Recycling Club was born. It was really a partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management and Rhode Island Resource Recovery, which runs the state's landfill. And what we decided to do was to go out and do the first ever study of all schools in the state to find out who was recycling and who wasn't. And we basically used a carrot and a stick approach, is that if schools weren't recycling, we would offer them assistance through Rhode Island Resource Recovery, and they would start recycling. But ones that did not want to, we would print a report card. And if the school said we are not recycling, and we were kind of dumpster diving, going in and finding out who actually was recycling, they get an F on the report card. And then what would happen is that we would send a press release to the local newspapers, and the newspapers would run the story. And Resource Recovery said, you know what? Nothing has ever worked to get schools on board for recycling except this. Because once an article ran, they would get in touch with Resource Recovery and say, what can we do? So it started with the front page story in the Providence Journal, which was this: Rhode Island schools flunk recycling. And in the early days, we went from 15% of schools having any kind of a recycling program to over 80%. However, there were so many problems with the program, and one is that the recyclable material was being picked up by custodians in the afternoon, and what do you think the custodians were doing? They were taking it and they were throwing it into the dumpster. So it was kind of a bit of a game of cat and mouse. So that's how we began. What we saw as we started doing this was that 70% of the waste coming out of the schools came from the lunchrooms. And so in about 2005, we started a program where we went to schools with 5-gallon buckets, with colanders, and we would teach them how to divert liquids away from their trash. I will just tell you that it is chaotic in school lunchrooms, trying to get the attention of the students. And so that's something that we continue to work on. In 2019, we got a grant from the Attorney General's office in the state of Rhode Island from a fine that was levied against Volkswagen for their emissions scandal. And we did the first ever study in the state to really find out how much food is wasted on a per student basis in the lunchrooms at school. So we're gonna have a little audience participation here. There's only two. The first is you have to vote on one of these things. Second is you can only vote once. Right? So you have to vote, you can only vote once. So who wastes more food in schools? Raise your hand if you think it's high school students. Raise your hand if you think it's middle school students. Raise your hand if you think it's elementary school students. Looks like high school is the one that you chose. By far, it is elementary school students. Why is it? It has to do with hot lunch. When a first grader gets served hot lunch, they get the same amount of food as a 12th grader. And the other thing is that in most schools, what they're doing is they're serving food. They're putting 5 different items on a plate, and the kids are throwing it away. In many schools, they don't know that students don't have to be given milk. So you have kids who take the milk container, they walk through the line, and they just throw the entire container away. Put this in perspective. If you have an elementary school with 500 students, they waste 43,200 pounds of food per year, 21 tons of food. It's a big problem. So I want to just talk a little bit about what we do and how we do it successfully. Because my background is in broadcasting, what we figured out early on is that we had to create a conversation in the general public about the issue of food waste and recycling. And so what we do is we call it narrowcast. And so we create a little story that we then use to get newspapers and television stations to cover. So we get into the minds of the assignment editor at a television station, and we always go for a story which is called the kicker story. So you'll notice at the end of a broadcast, what happens is that the last story is typically a little uplifting, it's a little bit fun, and that's what we try to do. So we take the little story, and then we use that to get more statewide coverage. So in 2014, there was a bill that had been written to mandate that food waste would be diverted away from the landfill. The legislature hadn't even agreed to hear the bill. And so we decided to put on a press event at the State House. And so we trucked in about 200 students that were diverting food scraps, and they were diverting food scraps to a pig farm. And so we thought, how are we gonna get the TV cameras there? And we thought, what if we bring in a bunch of pigs? And we set up the pigs in cages on the steps of the State House. Maybe that would be enough. And the other thing is that we got an elementary school teacher to agree to kiss one of the piglets live on television. So this is what happened. And by the way, when you see her go to kiss the pig, we were afraid that the pig was going to bite her. He was very upset. So you'll see me with sunglasses on, reaching over to make sure that nobody was harmed.
Back down, details at 5 o'clock. Court on Smithville. A couple of real life pokers took over Smithville this morning. Part of an initiative pushing food scrap recycling in Rhode Island. We see a lot of strange things in the State House lately. This may talk, right? Little guys' appetites are actually helping lighten the load in central landfill.
NBC 1060 Stein spoke with those backing the proposal to send the state's food scraps to the farm.
Swine at the State House. Today, we mean that in a literal sense. These pigs are part of a recycling program started by students. They're being recognized for their efforts to reduce food waste in lunchrooms by taking scraps to the My Blue Heaven pig farm in Pasco.
I offer my congratulations to you for starting it off.
Representative Donna Walsh sponsored a bill that would require businesses to divert food waste from the Johnson landfill and begin composting. It starts by mandating massive companies, those producing more than 52 tons of food waste annually, to compost. By 2021, everyone would be included. But there's a catch. Rhode Island doesn't currently have enough composting facilities to take on that demand.
And if we don't have the facilities, it will not go into effect until we do have the facilities built and online and ready to go.
Some businesses like the Small Point Cafe are already doing this.
So we just decided to limit it as much as possible.
The cafe on Westminster Street composts almost all of its waste, but it sent a business out of state to do so.
It's sad because our landfill is on the verge of filling up, and most waste from restaurants is food waste.
So their business goes to Massachusetts. In short, for the bill to make a difference, composters would need to set up shop here. In the meantime, more creative composting will be celebrated, but not required. Susie Steinle, NBC 10 News.
What happens? It's the law. So 2014, the food waste ban, 52 tons. Schools were exempt from that. And so we really pushed in 2019, 2020, change the definition of schools to include school districts. So now 80% of the schools in Rhode Island are now under this food waste ban. So we're currently, thankfully, working on a Healthy Communities grant right now. We are working with 4 schools and really testing best practices in preparation for the new law on how best to educate children about the importance of diverting. We have waste warriors, cafeteria rangers. Students run the waste separation within the lunchroom. We do waste audits. We put together a toolkit with lots of videos and how-tos. I would just say, nobody reads it. We'll have a school that wants to get involved. We'll give them the toolkit. We'll say, take you an hour to read it. And so we've learned from that, and now we're breaking it into little pieces. The challenge that we found is that it's very difficult to get middle schoolers and high schoolers to start doing this. Really have to do it at the elementary school. At the elementary school, it's a dream of doing it. So we get them in elementary school, live with them. And then the other thing that's kind of cool that we're working on is a study of psychological empowerment. Any school that's getting involved, that all of the students take a survey about how they view the environment. We're able to track them throughout their entire school years because we have their lunch number that is used for hot lunch. And then at the end of each year, they take the same survey and we're able to see the progress. So thank you very much.
And no pressure to answer, but before doing. Just say.
Can you fix her mic? Yeah. Push it right down.
Good. Okay, I'll reintroduce myself to those that haven't. So my name is Prashana, and I work with the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. And as Chris mentioned, we received a FY22 Healthy Communities grant. And we are partnering with the United Community Services, or NLCS, on End Food Waste Initiative. So NLCS is a residential service in the Maverick Landing community of East Boston, in larger Boston area. And it falls under, the project falls under Region 1's target programs of environmental justice. And for those that are familiar with the area, East Boston ticks off all 3 categories for Massachusetts environmental justice communities. So they're low income, a high population of minorities, and also have a high population of folks that have limited English proficiency over the age of 14. So this project, the vision for this project is to really achieve zero wasted food through food recovery. So Chris talked about composting for food waste, and we're trying to recover food before it becomes food waste. NLCS partners with a local organization that recovers food called Care Foods in the Boston area. And they divert about 1,700 pounds per week, of which about only 50 pounds of that is actual wasted food that's not good to redistribute. So what this does is it helps empower residents in low-income communities by reselling it at low cost instead of giving them food for free, and NLCS doesn't want to do that in order to help residents support themselves. So it's all about empowerment while also recovering food. That is still safe. Another big deliverable out of this project, and it's one of the biggest deliverables out of this project, was to create a 6-month education plan for the youth that NLCS hires. And we have a steering committee, and we decided on 5 topics surrounding introduction to sustainable agriculture, food security and food recovery, community gardens and urban settings, while also helping climate change, and connection and relationship with climate change and food systems, as well as a local chef session. That is very familiar with the East Boston community. To teach the children how to use local foods that are seasonal, as well as using all parts of it for also that the students would be able to participate on the time of year. And we're hosting that one at the end of August, so which is very exciting with that. Another big focus that we're trying to teach the students is understanding date labels. There's a lot of myths around date labeling. While it's not a focus of this project, it's something that a lot of low-income communities and communities in general have a lot of understanding. And then at the end, we're really hosting another major goal out of this project is a celebratory event. Celebrate the larger East Boston community as well as surrounding communities, Chelsea and Everett, to kind of come together and say, hey, this is what we're doing. We're diverting about 1,700 pounds per week of food and giving it to people that we need it. Another deliverable for this project is to partner with the property manager at NHDES and the city of Boston to implement a long-term strategy for collection of food waste. So what can this community do if they do have food waste? Right down the street is it's called the Project Foster Bin, so it's a city of Boston project. That they have 6 or 7 bins throughout the city to collect food waste for residents. But it's not big enough for a big community. These larger housing developments need access and support from the city to be able to set up areas in which we provide those services for their residents. So that's another big deliverable, starting with conversations and really creating a short-term strategy in order to have that long-term strategy. That was not. But that's all for me.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right in the back? Thumbs up, excellent. See if I can navigate the technology here. Thank you all for attending this workshop. Just a quick show of hands, who's from Vermont? New Hampshire? Oh, love New Hampshire. Massachusetts? Connecticut? Maine? Okay, excellent. As the program says, my name is John Michael Muse, I'm also known as Max. So if you run into me, please feel free to use that nickname. I've got it as a young man with bright red hair with a hyphenated name just outside the city of Boston. I needed an alias. As the bio says, I've been working for the United States Department of Agriculture for about 32 years. I started when I was 15. And I've lasted that long because, the department or my particular agency changes every few years. We get a new political appointment. So it's always been an exciting opportunity to have programs that you can deliver to rural communities that make a difference. And so I'm going to start out today about the big picture, 30,000 foot view, and then we're going to drill down to programs that probably will be beneficial to hopefully your organizations and your communities. Don't try to absorb everything I'm telling you right now or sharing with you. But the most important thing you get is my contact information. What USDA Rural Development prides itself on is we're a federal agency with global presences. My jurisdiction is Vermont and New Hampshire, but we have 48 in the country, and we'll be able to get you to the people in Massillon, Rhode Island, York, Urbana, wherever you come from. The programs are identical because they're federal programs. But like I said, the most important thing you get is contact information. We're really user friendly. You can call us 6 times a day if you have questions. You're not going to follow us. We go through these applications every day. You might go through them just once in your career. So please use our resources to be able to help you navigate the programs. So, the first thing I always ask people is, what do you think about when you hear about USDA? Anyone? Food, right? Meat inspection. Let's see, maybe it's, commodity programs, maybe it's things like that. Well, USDA has many parts to it. Whoops. And actually, rural development falls under one of 7 mission areas of the department. Very important to understand because, like I said, we all do different things at the department level. In our particular agency, I affectionately call it, we're the economic arm of the department. Right? So, and
the reason why rural development is under the USDA is because we only focus on rural America. And that's another thing that probably conjures up in your mind is what is rural, right? And we define rural by population and income. We'll get to that in a little bit. So, but it's just more important to understand that, we have many parts to the department. Think of us as the economic arm of the department. And there'll be some good news and bad news, because seeing we're rural, we don't focus on urban. So if you are in a community above our population, unfortunately, we can't participate. But there's probably some people out there that could. Most of New Hampshire, which is the predominant attendees in the crowd, is eligible for our programs. Southern New Hampshire, not so much. So rural development's mission is to increase economic opportunity and improve the quality of life of rural Americans. We do that through financing mechanisms. So any program that we offer has 3 ways to invest financially in a rural area. We have loan guarantees, so that a bank can come to us and wants to do, say, a food co-op project in a rural area, but they feel a little nervous about the collateral. They might come to us to be able to assist with financing that project. Typically, our guarantees are picking up where Small Business Administration leaves off. So we're typically in the $5 to $25 million range. So, we are a major player for those. Direct loans, we act like a bank, but we're not. We're a federal agency. As you know, if you filled out one federal application, you filled out one federal application. So, there are more processes and strings attached. We talk about free money. I don't think there's anything ever free, right? There's always some sort of catch or caveat or something else. And then we have the all-elusive grant programs. Everybody wants a grant. I want a grant. Not everybody can get a grant. So moving right along, rural development is actually a mission area under the department. And under that mission area, we have 3 agencies that are operating. So we have a rural utility service, which focuses on infrastructure. Think about broadband. Think about water and sewer treatment plants for a community. Think about distance learning, telemedicine. We can do things like that. And we have a rural housing service, which by name, we help a lot of people buy their first homes. We help people that live in their homes, stay in their homes by doing repair programs, and we also have multi-family housing complexes and such. In addition, which is the program that's probably going to be most interesting to you all today, we have a community facilities program for essential not-for-profit and municipal entities providing services. And then we have a rural business and cooperative service, as it says, that's the business aspect of the mission area. So I said population was an eligibility criteria. Rural utility service, 10,000 or less in population. But even more so, if I can spend somebody else's money, I love doing that. So again, contact information. Love to hear about what you have going on in the community. If it's something we can help with, great. If not, we'll try to find a resource that might be able to help you out. Wrong way. So as I mentioned, all those different program areas, we have like 40 plus different loan and grant programs that focuses on these 4 categories here. I think about the business community. I talked about, the co-ops and the things like that that we might be able to assist with loan guarantees. We do have technical assistance programs that can help out as well. Our community programs, that's the program you're probably most interested in. That's for not-for-profits and municipalities. We fund things like daycares, libraries, museums, high schools, arts and culture facilities, and solid waste and composting facilities too, which we're going to get to as well. Housing programs, again, we all live in communities where people are trying to move there, work there, they need housing. We have housing programs that are subsidized, they can get people into a house that they normally probably wouldn't be able to get into. And then utilities, if you're hearing in the news, infrastructure is the big deal, right? We get it in rural development. And I mention all these programs to you because not only are you here for a professional reason, you all live in communities that need things. So please, if I've sparked any thoughts in your head, let me know, because besides why you're here today, if there's a way we can help your community be healthier, prosper, and things like that, we want to do that. So why am I here today? Okay. So as I mentioned, our community facilities program is probably one of our widely used programs for municipalities and not-for-profits. Again, I mentioned that, 20,000 or less in population, talked about the type of activities that we can finance. Pretty much we finance things you can touch, right? Equipment, building construction, building purchases, renovations, vehicles, things like that. We've done a lot of different ambulances, fire trucks and things of that nature, community centers, arts organizations, and as I indicated, solid waste and recycling facilities. I don't think Bob Spencer's here from Windham Solid Waste Management District. He left. Any of you applied to our agency? No. Yeah. Excellent. Well, you can always share when I get through this about how to go, right? Because don't believe me. Ask the customer. So as I mentioned, the community facilities program has guarantees, direct loans, and grants. As I indicated before, too, not everybody's eligible for a grant. Our loan program, if you're a not-for-profit, is probably the best financing you'll find. It's a fixed interest rate. Currently, it's 2.5%. You can finance 100% of a project. And the term can be for the useful life of the asset. So if you think about real estate improvements, 30 years, equipment, 7 to 10 years, depending on what that might be there. The grant program is based on median household income and population compared to the state that you live in. And again, these are all communities of 20,000 or less, and they're matching grants. So depending on the poverty of the community, really, you could be a 15% grant eligible, 35%, 55 or 75% grant eligible community. And that's a percentage of the total project cost, or it maxes out at $50,000. So they're not huge grants, but they're grants that can help out. Windham Solid Waste Management was able to get some funding for us to replace a loader. Not a sexy piece of equipment, but a very necessary one if you're doing composting and other things around recycling as part of being able to use that for materials there. The match to those grant program, it can be almost anything except in kind. So we play very well with other federal resources. Anytime you look at mixing and matching resources, you always want to look at what their grant agreement tells you to see what you might be able to match there. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring some examples. So, New Hampshire dominant, right? Just some examples of things that we've been able to assist with our funding. And these were grants. Effingham, they had a problem that they couldn't even access their facility because a bridge went up. Really critical piece of infrastructure that was needed there. We worked with the applicant to figure out how we could in fact do that and help them out. They were able to get that repaired so that their facility could be fully functional. Look at New Hampshire, a glass crusher. Not a fun thing to say, I want to crush glass today. Again, another piece of equipment that was necessary to be able to process the materials that are coming into the facility there. And then we also were able to do some stormwater work. We're always very interested in how we can assist with that type of activity as well. The Northeast Kingdom in Vermont, a baler. These things wear out, and they're very critical pieces of equipment there. So you could define a project as a baler and a rock crusher. Come into us and we look at that as a total project cost and see what the grant percentage we might be able to help out with or loan, and then hopefully enable you to be able to assist. And then the Windham Solid Waste District, as I mentioned, was a front-end loader. We're currently having conversations with them for a covering for their composting facility. They're the second largest composter, I believe, in the state of Vermont. When you're composting that amount of material, you need to cover it up so it doesn't just leak into the rivers and streams when it rains out, right? So we're looking at assisting them with some recovery for that, as well as some equipment as well there. And then in Bethel, Vermont, scales. That's another thing a lot of these facilities have or need. And we were able to help them with replacing the scales at their facility there. So that's contact information. I did bring some handouts for all the programs we do offer and the grant eligibility for communities in Vermont, New Hampshire. On this slide, you'll notice that the website is identical except the suffix. So if you're in Rhode Island, put an RI on it. If you're in New York, put an NY on it. ANME, and you'll get to the local site there. If you have no luck there, call me. I'll find out who the heck you should be talking to in the other states and be able to get you connected. Probably some of the most important things to understand is timeline, right? So we're a federal agency. We get funded October 1st through September 30th. Depending on the program, it could be a national offering, a NOFA, or it could be local. The community facilities program is local. You can submit a paper application and submit it into our portal and talk to people on the phone that are going to process your application. So like I said, one of our strengths is we have a real strong local presence. We have 3 offices in New Hampshire and 3 in Vermont. And again, we'll get you the right person there. Timeline is really critical. You all probably experience capital budgets, capital needs. You got to think ahead. Chris and I are talking about that. Mandates that come down don't always line up with funding opportunities. So I always say early and often talk to us about what you have so that we can help you navigate that resource there. At the time of application, if you are a grant eligible community, match should be identified because you don't want to get hung up about that. Grant dollars are so finite and they're so sought after. We want to make sure you're in a well prepared position to view it. As I indicated, if you're not grant eligible, you are loan eligible potentially if your population is under 20,000. So the benefits of our program, like I said, is when we process an application, we get to the approval, we obligate the money in your name and pocket with a fixed interest rate on it. You do your project, purchase your equipment, things like that, we reimburse at the end. If it's a loan, then if the interest rate went lower by that time, we'll give you the lower interest rate. But it mitigates the risk of interest rate fluctuation. In this environment, if your project is inevitable and imminent, borrowing money at a lower rate is not such a bad strategy to get your project done, because as we all know, I don't think anything ever goes down, it always goes up. So, as bad as the D word is, debt, our debt is probably one that's very, very beneficial to entities. Let's see. I think I've covered all the highlights there. I'll stop there. Again, I have some materials, my contact information, and I don't know if we're going to do a question and answer period this one. So thank you very much.
A lot of good information for sure. We did learn we have to yell at kids more because they're wasting and they're swine in the state house. So a lot of good information. Any questions? Eric.
Oh, sure, it's the last slide, somehow or another it got whatever. The order got a little wonky, terrible. I don't think you pushed them.
And this is being recorded, so it will be available online on the NRRA website. So one question I have is how often can we actually apply for these grants? Can we do it every year? Is there a limit?
For our particular community facilities program, we get an annual allocation from Congress. We do try to aggregate demand by putting in some deadlines to have applications submitted, but it's rolling. You can apply anytime during the year. The funding cycle, like I said, it starts out strong, and then we get a lot of people in the queue, and then we don't have as much money to go forward. But my 32-year history with the department, it's not if we ever fund something, it's when. So it's annual, and anytime we try to aggregate demands. We get appropriations every single year, so it's a very consistent program, I would say.
And for us, the two grant programs I talked about, the education and outreach and SWIFFers, solid waste infrastructure grants, brand new grant programs do not have anything like a history. I expect the RFA will be out in September. We usually give you 60 days to apply. Our Healthy Community Grants is an annual grant solicitation, generally comes out in March. And I mentioned it just closed on May 9th. So that one's pretty consistent. If you Google Healthy Communities and EPA Region 1, you can see that. Or send me an email and we can make sure you're on the list for next year.
Do you provide loans or grants for rural gravel roads?
So roads are an eligible item that we can finance. I think there might be better tools, like the Department of Transportation might have more granting opportunities. But yeah, no, we've done, as we indicated with FEM, we've done bridges, and roads are certainly eligible as well. And I would like to say about our application process, as a federal agency, if you submit an application that's incomplete, we don't send it back to you. We send you a letter saying, thank you, now you know what's the rest of the stuff. And we have a back and forth. People always ask about how long the process takes. Well, it all depends on how complete the application was and how much you go back and forth, any environmental issues and so on and so forth. But we can do those type of projects. But again, we always try to figure out what's the best resource for you to be able to access.
Yeah, unfortunately, our grants are one and done. You put in a grant application, you get a thumbs up, thumbs down. We're not as nice. So. But I will say, for example, Radian and I talked before our solicitation went out, so I gave her a really good idea of, what she needed to do, and our rate has not applied in quite a while. So as long as our grant solicitation is open, we can have a conversation that is a little bit more collegial and helpful.
Question for Matt. On the rural grants and loans, there is a population criteria, and is there also a household median income criteria that you need to satisfy?
So for our housing programs, income is very sensitive. We need to evaluate that. That's definitely an eligibility criteria. For our lending programs, not so much. And for our granting programs, it's census data. So basically, we're getting the MHI, median household income, and the population of the service area. Typically, it's a municipality, so talk about a town. And we just use that data to determine what percentage grant they might be eligible for. And that's why some communities are not grant eligible, however, loan eligible if they're still under the 20,000 population criteria.
Question for Christopher. As you've tracked behaviors over a period of time, have you yet gotten to seniors who have been through your educational program from elementary on through? And the reason I ask is that in 20 years of doing college university recycling, ironically, the worst behaviors we had were the students who had had elementary education about recycling. By the time they got to college, they only associated with elementary school little kiddish stuff. And it was something that turned them off to the behaviors of college. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that similar trend or if you're able to target your educational message as they evolve through the system.
That's a good question. It's new for us to be tracking it, and we finally really figured out the idea about having a way to identify them. and, you know, through the lunchroom number. So we just started collecting that data, and I'm really looking forward to seeing really what happens in the long term.
I have a question for Krishana. How are you getting people to participate in those wonderful programs that you are offering, which sound like they're mostly educational? Just curious.
Of course, so the educational programs are directed or geared towards the youth that MLCS, our partner organization, hires throughout the year. So it's offering trying to stay away from a didactic approach and really making it really fun and engaging, using popular education strategies to take a really heavy technical turned product and technical topic and trying to get into something that is digestible for them. So target population are those youth that are hired. And then at the celebratory event that I mentioned, having the youth share that experience with their community residents.
I also had a question for you. You mentioned briefly that one side project is educating around date labeling, and I just wasn't quite sure what that meant. Is that just for like expired?
Of course, yes. So date labeling in terms of that date that is on food products that tells you if a food is expired or not. And the reason we're doing that is, you know, Nemo is also working on another project in the Onondaga County, Syracuse area of New York that focuses on prevention tips for food waste for residential. So kind of borrowing what we've learned about date labels and that there's no set law that requires manufacturers to label based on safety versus just setting it to get it off the shelves and move it really quickly. So sometimes you'll see, you know, families will see that, you know, a can of beans is labeled past date. It's still safe to eat, but because of that label, they end up throwing it out, creating food waste for food that's still safe to eat.
Ironically, there are no federal laws for date labeling except infant formula. That's another story. So date labels are generally, you know, peak quality, and they're not related to safety at all. And I think we all have a relative who goes into the refrigerator, throws out the yogurt, the end of the day, it's expired, and it's perfectly healthy. And we always just say be practical, right? Use your nose, use your eyes. You can tell when something's bad. So date labeling is a huge issue.
This question is from Heather, who is, she's watching from home to Rhode Island is how she put this. Have you had other states inquire about your programs? It sounds like a great tool to repeat.
We have not, although we have reached out to other states, and our toolkit is really based upon a toolkit from Illinois. And we work with them to actually customize ours, but I have not had another state reach out. I would say we've also looked at Vermont, which Vermont has been a leader, and we've got a lot of information from Vermont.
I have a question for Rhode Island too.
Nice to meet you.
Mr. Radcliffe, I noticed when the legislator was talking about the bill that she introduced to require the diversion of food waste, she said that it wouldn't become effective until there was infrastructure available to receive it. And I just wondered how all that worked out, because one of the problems with these laws is having infrastructure to receive the things that you're banning from the waste, banning from the landfill.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There are a number of composting facilities that have opened since the bill was signed into law. There's a couple that had started and then realized it wasn't for them and closed. I would say the biggest challenge that we've got is it's not so much the capacity to be able to find composting facilities, it's transportation. it's far more expensive to transfer food waste to a composting facility than it is to just throw it in trash and have it brought to the landfill. And that's really the challenge that we've got right now. I will say specifically with the schools, we tested something this past year that worked out quite well. There is a composter called Bootstrap Composting. They're in Rhode Island, they're in Massachusetts as well. And they have a residential composting component where for a certain fee, they'll come to your house and they'll pick up your food waste. And so we asked them if they would give us a discount for the schools. So they would pick up at a 50% discount to the schools. If in return, we would promote them to the parents of the student body. And it worked. They were able to get some good press in the newsletter and get some customers out of it. So we, as an organization, realized that we have to solve the problem. We have to drive down the cost of transportation. The other thing that we looked at is the hauling agreements. The haulers are going and they're showing up once a week or twice a week. And some of these contracts with schools, they're for 3 or 4 years. So we've tried to open up the contracts, have a component where they start picking up the food scraps, because truly the waste stream, 70% of it in the schools that we work with hits the lunchroom. So if we can reduce the waste by 70%, there has to be some offset in the contract. And so those are things that we're looking at.
Also say too, I made a point before that there's 4 states that have legislation about organics and landfills. 3 of those states have what I call it, if you build it, they will come. And that's what I think she meant. So the law says if there's a facility, and it's a little bit different in each of the 3 states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Vermont, 15 or 20 miles from where the waste is generated, you must go to a facility. If there's not a facility in that radius, then you're exempt from the law until a facility is there. Massachusetts is the only state in the New England region where all bets are off. There is no transportation distance. And also in Rhode Island, which was interesting because it's such a small state, it didn't have to be a facility in your state. We did some mapping, so it could be a border state, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and I think Chris mentioned that you're using some vendors in Massachusetts with the schools. So if you build it, they will come is kind of what I think she was driving at in that message.
I would just add that, my presentation talked, focusing on the solid waste and those type of facilities. We can finance schools as well. So if the school had equipment needs to be able to compost or aggregate the material, we could help them with that. If there was a not-for-profit or even a school that needed a vehicle, we could probably finance that as well. So again, it's not always just your organization that has needs. It could be the partners or some of the other entities that you're hearing, like they would love to do that, but they needed more bins. And as we know, money's tight. We love to have a conversation with anybody and anyone that has a need like that.
Time for one more question.
Well, it's a little bit more of a statement. My name is Andrea with the NRRA, and I'm happy that you can add us to the list of USDA Rural Utilities Service grant recipients for our Recycle Right campaign and our Solid Waste Advisory Team program that we have running right now. So thank you.
And thank you for the plug. And I always say that, all the resources that we represent here are just pots of money. Without champions like NRA and yourselves out there in the audience that want to engage and access those programs, that money sits idle. So thank you all for being applicants and weathering through the federal application process. And if we can help to get you through those type of things, we'd be happy to do it. Thanks.